Look at her cheap clothes." The words sliced through the soft jazz music like a razor through silk. The wealthy fiancé smirked, looking down at the housekeeper's little daughter. But what the billionaire did next sent shock waves through the entire high society crowd, leaving everyone in absolute silence. I still get chills just thinking about how this night unfolded. Imagine a tiny, 3-year-old girl stepping onto the polished marble floors of the most exclusive penthouse party in the city, wearing a faded dress that probably cost less than a cup of coffee. And right there, in front of the city's most powerful elites, a woman draped in a $30,000 designer gown pointed her manicured finger and laughed right in that baby's face. She spat out the cruelest, most humiliating words you could ever say about a defenseless child who was too innocent to even understand what was happening. But nobody in that grand ballroom was prepared for what the billionaire did when those vicious words reached his ears. Not the high-profile guests, not the photographers, and certainly not the little girl's mother, who was standing just a few feet away, frozen in absolute shock, desperately fighting back her tears. This is a story that will stay with your soul for a very long time, I promise you that. Welcome back, beautiful people. If you are new here, this channel is your sanctuary for real, deeply emotional stories that touch your heart, shake your soul, and remind you of what truly matters in this fleeting life. Before we dive into the depths of today's incredible journey, I want to ask you a quick question. Where in this beautiful world are you watching from right now? Take a brief moment to drop your city or country in the comments below, because I absolutely love seeing how far these messages of love and humanity travel across the globe. Now, what you're about to hear is an extraordinary tale that begins in a glittering ballroom full of immense wealth and power, but ends in a way that will make your heart overflow with warmth. It is emotional, it is shocking, and it features a twist that absolutely nobody saw coming. So, get comfortable, clear your mind, and let this story take you on a powerful, emotional ride. Because sometimes the richest rooms in the world hold the poorest hearts, and sometimes the smallest, most overlooked person in the building carries the greatest amount of human dignity. His name was Arthur Sterling. At 32 years old, he was a self-made billionaire who had built a massive real estate empire entirely from scratch. But his past was vastly different from his present. His father had spent his entire life as a weary construction worker, coming home with bleeding calluses on his hands, while his mother had spent her nights scrubbing corporate offices under the dim moonlight just so they could afford groceries. Arthur had spent his childhood studying by the flickering light of a single desk lamp, vowing to lift his family out of poverty. He never forgot where he came from. He carried his humble beginnings with him every single day like a heavy, grounding stone in his chest that kept his soul anchored no matter how high his financial success soared. By the time he turned 30, Arthur owned premier properties across 12 different states. By 32, his face had graced the covers of 3 major international business magazines. Yet, he was renowned not just for his staggering wealth, but for his impeccable, rare character. He was the kind of billionaire who knew the first names of every single person who worked in his buildings, the janitors, the overnight security guards, the kitchen staff. He treated everyone with profound respect, viewing human beings as souls to be cherished, not furniture to be used. However, when it came to matters of the heart, Arthur had always been a little slower, a little more cautious. He had dated occasionally over the years, but no relationship had ever truly taken root until he met Cassandra Vance at a high-end charity gala 2 years prior. Cassandra was 29, and she was stunning in every superficial way that the world tends to notice first. She had grown up in an environment of extreme old money, the daughter of a prominent, highly influential family, and she moved through life with a seamless, effortless confidence that only comes from never once being told the word no. She was sharp, exceptionally witty, and immensely charming in elite social circles, knowing exactly what to say to the right people at the precise time. Arthur had been swept up in her vibrant, dazzling energy far too quickly. They had been engaged for 6 months now, with a lavish wedding planned for the upcoming spring. Tonight's grand party, held at Arthur's magnificent luxury penthouse, was their official engagement celebration. There were 200 elite guests, a live jazz band playing smooth melodies, exquisite catering from the finest Michelin-starred restaurant in the city, massive crystal chandeliers, and champagne that cost more per bottle than an average family spent on groceries in an entire month. But tucked away somewhere in that grand, glittering world of the ultra-wealthy, there was Elena Santos. Elena was 41 years old and had worked faithfully as Arthur's personal housekeeper for the past 7 years. She was a quiet, exceptionally diligent, and deeply loyal woman. Elena always arrived long before the morning sunrise and left well after the sun had set beneath the horizon. She kept that massive penthouse running like a perfectly timed, well-oiled clock, and Arthur trusted her with his life. He had seen her work through the hardest of times without a single word of complaint, including the devastating, painful period after her beloved husband passed away 4 years ago, leaving her entirely alone to raise their daughter. That daughter was Lily. At just 3 years old, Lily had big, expressive brown eyes, 2 adorable little pigtails bouncing on her head, and a pure, ringing laugh that could honestly light up the darkest room she walked into. Elena had absolutely no intention of bringing Lily to the high-profile party tonight. She had meticulously arranged for her next-door neighbor to watch her, but the neighbor had suddenly called out sick at the very last minute. Caught in a desperate position between not wanting to leave her precious daughter alone and not wanting to fail Arthur on such an important evening, Elena had quietly brought Lily along with her, keeping her tucked safely away in the back staff kitchen, praying that absolutely no one would notice her presence. But Lily, being an inquisitive 3-year-old child, had entirely different ideas. Somewhere between 7 and 8 in the evening, while Elena was momentarily distracted tending to a spill in the linen room, Lily quietly wandered out of the staff kitchen. She was wearing a humble, second-hand dress, a pale yellow fabric adorned with tiny white flowers, slightly faded from repeated washings, which Elena had lovingly purchased from a local thrift store for just $4.99. The little girl toddled right out onto the edge of the grand ballroom, her eyes wide with absolute wonder and innocence at all the shimmering lights, the beautiful music, and the elegantly dressed people. And that is the exact moment Cassandra spotted her. What do you think was going through little Lily's pure mind as she stood at the edge of that sparkling ballroom, looking at all those blinding lights? Have you ever witnessed the magic of a child discovering something beautiful for the very first time? It is a reminder of the purity we often lose as adults. You see, what a person says and does when they think no one important is watching. That is who they truly are when the mask comes off. Cassandra was standing with a small, elite group of her wealthy friends near the edge of the crowded dance floor. They were women just like her, polished, heavily perfumed, holding crystal glasses of expensive champagne in their manicured hands. They were laughing loudly about something exclusive when one of her friends suddenly nudged Cassandra's arm and nodded dismissively toward the tiny girl standing at the entrance of the ballroom. Lily just stood there in her pale yellow thrift store dress, completely unaware that she had stepped into a world where she supposedly did not belong. She was simply staring up at the massive crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, her little mouth slightly open, her eyes reflecting the sparkling lights. She looked like a tiny, beautiful human being who had just discovered magic for the very first time in her life. To any normal person possessing a functioning, empathetic human heart, it was the most adorable, heartwarming sight in the entire room. But Cassandra did not see an adorable child. Cassandra saw an ugly stain. She looked down at Lily the exact way an elitist looks at a dirty mark on a pristine white tablecloth. Her perfectly shaped eyebrow arched in disgust, and her lips curled into a mocking sneer. Then, in a voice that was not explicitly shouting, but was absolutely loud enough to cut through the surrounding conversations, she turned to her wealthy friends and said, "Look at her cheap clothes." She laughed, a cold, mocking sound. Her friends looked visibly uncertain, even slightly uncomfortable with the cruelty, but they chose to say nothing. Emboldened by their silence, Cassandra continued, making sure the cluster of high society people nearby could hear her clearly. "Who on earth let a maid's kid wander in here? This is a sophisticated 200-guest event, not a charity daycare." The vicious words hit the air and seemed to hang there like a heavy, toxic fog. A few nearby guests quickly exchanged uncomfortable glances. A passing waiter paused almost imperceptibly, his tray trembling slightly in his hand. A wealthy woman, standing near the extravagant dessert table, pressed her lips tightly together in disapproval and looked away, refusing to intervene. Little Lily, bless her pure heart, had absolutely no idea she was the subject of such cruel mockery. She had just spotted the towering dessert table from across the room and was now slowly, purposefully making her way toward it with complete innocence and total joy. But Elena heard it. She had just stepped out of the linen room and was crossing the edge of the hallway when Cassandra's sharp, mocking words reached her ears with painful clarity. Elena stopped dead in her tracks. Her hand tightened with crushing force around the folded linen napkin she was carrying. She did not cry out, nor did she let a single tear fall. Over years of quiet, exhausting, and often thankless hard work, she had learned exactly how to freeze her face into an emotionless mask when life dealt her a painful blow. But her eyes expressed an ocean of profound heartbreak and protective maternal rage. She moved swiftly and softly across the floor toward Lily, scooping her young daughter up into her arms before the child could reach the dessert table, gently murmuring soothing words into her tiny ear. Lily simply giggled happily, reaching up to touch her mother's cheap earring, completely safe and utterly unbothered in her mother's embrace. Elena held her daughter tightly against her chest, turned her back to the crowd, and began walking rapidly toward the safety of the kitchen. Elena truly believed that was the end of the humiliating ordeal. She thought she would just swallow the bitter insult the way she had swallowed so many hardships over the years, bury it deep inside her soul, and keep moving forward for the sake of her child. She had absolutely no idea that Arthur had been standing a mere 12 feet away the entire time. He had been walking from the direction of the bar, heading back to rejoin the main gathering, when he heard Cassandra's unmistakable voice. He had stopped frozen in his tracks. He had listened to every single cruel, degrading syllable that had left his fiancée's mouth. And then he had watched in silence as Elena, a woman who had served his home with absolute devotion for 7 years, picked up her innocent daughter and walked away with her head bowed in shame. Arthur stood perfectly still for what felt like an eternity. His champagne glass was gripped firmly in his hand. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face strained, and his eyes intently followed Elena until her faded yellow dress disappeared completely through the swinging kitchen doors. Then he slowly turned his gaze and looked directly at Cassandra. She had not noticed him standing there yet. She was still laughing softly with her elite friends, casually adjusting her diamond bracelet, utterly unbothered by the emotional devastation she had just caused. And in that exact moment, Arthur felt something massive shift deep inside his soul, something quiet, profound, and entirely permanent. It felt exactly like a heavy iron door slamming shut forever in the deepest chamber of his chest. Do you think Arthur should have confronted Cassandra right then and there, in front of all 200 high society guests, creating a massive scene? Or was it wiser to wait until the party ended and the guests had left? What would you have done if you found yourself standing in his exact shoes? You see, sometimes in life, one single, unexpected moment pulls back a beautiful curtain and exposes exactly who a person is at their core. And once you see that raw truth, you can never unsee it. Arthur did not make a dramatic scene. That was never his way. He possessed the quiet, controlled discipline of a man who knew how to command a room without ever raising his voice. He took a long, slow, centering breath, calmly set his glass down on the silver tray of a passing waiter, and walked with measured, deliberate steps toward the kitchen door. He pushed it open gently, stepping out of the glittering, loud ballroom and into the quiet, brightly lit, stainless steel kitchen. Inside, Elena was gently setting Lily down on a small chair in a quiet corner, handing her a simple bread roll from a staff tray to keep her occupied. Lily grabbed the roll with both of her tiny hands and began gnawing on it with absolute happiness. Elena looked up and immediately saw Arthur standing there in his fine tuxedo. Her face instantly flushed with panic and deep, quiet apology. "Mr. Sterling, I am so incredibly sorry," she said rapidly, her voice shaking as she kept it low. "My neighbor canceled on me at the very last minute. I know I should have called you, but it was the night of your engagement party, and I didn't want to burden you with my personal problems of all nights. Lily was in the back room the whole time. I swear I don't know how she managed to slip out. I am so sorry. I will keep her right here in the corner. It won't happen again, I promise." "Elena!" Arthur's voice was remarkably soft, cutting through her frantic apologies. "Stop!" He paused, looking at her with a calm, unreadable expression. Then he turned his gaze down to Lily, who now had little crumbs of bread roll smeared all over her chubby cheeks, and was intensely examining the silver buttons on the kitchen chair with the immense scientific interest that only a 3-year-old could muster. Arthur slowly pulled up a simple metal stool and sat down right there in the middle of the kitchen, wearing his expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo at his own high-profile engagement party. He looked up at Elena and asked her a question that she never could have anticipated. "How long have you been working here in my home, Elena?" She blinked in confusion, her hands trembling slightly. 7 years, Mr. Sterling. 7 years, Arthur repeated quietly, letting the weight of the time sink into the air. "And in all those 7 years, have I ever once made you feel like you or your beautiful daughter were not welcome in this home?" Elena's eyes instantly filled with hot, heavy tears. She quickly shook her head. "No, never, sir. You have always been incredibly kind to us." "Good," Arthur said firmly. He turned his attention back to Lily. The little girl had finally noticed Arthur sitting there and was now staring at him with a completely unfiltered, pure curiosity. "What is her name again?" Arthur asked softly. "Her name is Lily," Elena whispered. Arthur smiled warmly at the little girl, his eyes softening completely. "Hi, Lily." Lily stared back at the billionaire for a very long, intensely serious moment. Then, with complete innocence, she extended her hands and held her bread roll out toward him, offering him a bite. It was the beautiful way a 3-year-old child offers the person in front of them the most valuable, precious thing they currently possess in the world. Arthur's chest tightened, and an incredibly complex, deep emotion washed over his face. He leaned his tall frame forward and pretended to take a small, enthusiastic bite of the bread. "Thank you, Lily," he told her with absolute seriousness. "That is easily the best thing I have eaten all night long." Lily giggled with pure delight, quickly pulling her bread roll back toward her chest protectively. Arthur stood up from the stool. He turned to Elena and told her firmly that Lily could stay right there in the kitchen for as long as she needed to, that there was plenty of fresh food for her, and that Elena must never apologize to him for her daughter's presence ever again. Then he turned around and walked back out through the swinging doors into the roaring ballroom. The moment he crossed the room, Cassandra caught his eye. She flashed him that perfect, heavily practiced, radiant smile, the exact smile that he had once found completely irresistible. She began to gracefully glide across the marble floor toward him, undoubtedly intending to link her arm through his, to play the role of the beautiful, blissfully engaged couple, to be photographed by the press and to be admired by the city's elite. But as Arthur looked at her approaching form, he felt a sensation that he had been quietly, desperately ignoring for several months. He felt an absolute, piercing coldness, a profound distance. It wasn't the comfortable, secure distance of two people who know each other so deeply that they no longer need to perform for the world. It was a terrifying, hollow kind of distance, the vast chasm that lives between who a person truly is at their core and who you desperately forced yourself to believe they were. He thought about the words she had just spoken. He thought about the effortless lightness in her voice, the casual, easy cruelty of it, and the way her friends had laughed along. He thought about a pure, beautiful little girl in a $4 dress, staring up at a chandelier as if it were the most magnificent wonder in the universe. And right there, amidst the music and the clinking glasses, Arthur made a definitive decision. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't fueled by erratic anger. And it wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet, absolute, and unshakable decision. What do you think Arthur decided to do in that moment? Before you continue reading, honestly ask yourself, what would you have done if you were standing there hearing the person you were legally bound to marry speak such degrading words about an innocent child? You see, the truth about a person's soul does not always arrive with a loud, dramatic thunderclap. Sometimes the truth walks in quietly, wearing a pale yellow thrift store dress. Arthur did not end his engagement that night. He was a man of immense discipline, and he firmly believed that permanent life-altering decisions should never be executed in highly emotional moments. That specific discipline was a foundational part of what had made him a billionaire, and it was the very thing that made him a fair human being. He always gave people the benefit of the doubt, believing in thorough conversations before jumping to final conclusions. So he carried himself through the rest of the evening with stoic grace. After the massive crowd of guests had finally thinned out, after the jazz band had packed up their instruments, and while the catering staff were quietly clearing away the empty champagne glasses, Arthur quietly asked Cassandra to stay behind. They sat across from one another in the expansive, quiet living room of his penthouse. Behind them, through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the city skyline glittered like a million diamonds against the dark night sky. Cassandra sat back comfortably, sipping from a fresh glass of wine. Arthur sat forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands tightly folded together. In a calm, unshakable voice, he told her exactly what he had heard her say about Lily earlier that evening. Cassandra's face went through a rapid, highly complex series of transformations. First came utter surprise, followed quickly by a sharp flash of defensive anger, which she quickly masked with a carefully arranged, beautiful expression of remorse. "Arthur, darling, I didn't mean anything bad by it," she said smoothly, her voice dripping with practiced charm. "It was just a silly passing comment. I was honestly just caught completely off guard seeing a random, dirty child wandering around a highly exclusive formal party." "She is not a random child," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a quiet intensity. "She is Elena's daughter, and Elena has worked in this home, serving us with absolute loyalty for 7 years. I know exactly who Elena is," Cassandra countered, a sharp, elitist edge finally entering her tone. "But she absolutely should not have brought her child to a formal, high-profile engagement event without asking for permission first. That is a massive violation of professional boundaries, Arthur." "She had a family emergency," Arthur explained calmly. "Her child care fell through at the last minute. Then she should have called and sorted it out properly. There are always professional solutions to these things." Arthur looked deeply into her eyes, seeing the hollow vacuum beneath her beautiful exterior. "Cassandra, the child is 3 years old. She was simply standing there, looking up at the lights with pure wonder, and your very first human instinct was to mock her clothes and degrade her as a maid's kid in front of a crowd of people." Cassandra sharply set her wineglass down on the marble coffee table. "I think you are completely overreacting to a joke." And right there, the raw truth laid itself bare. There was no genuine apology. There was no real remorse or empathy. It was just a smooth, calculated redirect, a manipulative way of making him the problem for being deeply bothered by something that she genuinely believed was beneath her concern. Arthur sat with that realization in the heavy silence. As he looked at her, he thought about his own mother, who had scrubbed the floors of corporate buildings late into the night just so he could have a future. He thought about how his mother had dressed him in the absolute best clothes she could afford, and how he had still shown up to school in outfits that were visibly worn out, faded, and slightly too small. He remembered with vivid clarity how the wealthy kids had noticed. He remembered the burning shame of being viewed as lesser than simply because of the cheap clothes on his back. And then he thought about Lily, a 3-year-old child who would grow up and carry the subconscious weight of a wealthy woman pointing at her and laughing, even if she couldn't fully articulate the memory right now. He knew that those toxic early experiences land deep within a child's soul, shaping how they view their worth in the world. "I am not overreacting," Arthur said finally. His voice was entirely calm, completely, terrifyingly calm. "But I think we need to take some serious time apart before we even think about walking down the aisle. I think we need to be completely honest with each other about who we are." Cassandra's perfect composure cracked open. "What exactly does that mean, Arthur?" "It means," Arthur said with absolute deliberation, "that I need to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am marrying a woman who is genuinely good. Not just impressive, not just high society smart, but actually good. And tonight, what you did made me entirely unsure." The intense conversation that followed over the next hour was long, incredibly painful, and brutally honest in the way that life-altering conversations always are. Arthur did not issue aggressive ultimatums. He did not yell or hurl petty accusations. He simply laid out exactly how he felt, what he required from a life partner, and what he believed a real marriage required at its spiritual foundation. Cassandra left the penthouse that night deeply upset. She wasn't crying. That was beneath her pride, but she was shaken to her absolute core. She had never in her entire life encountered a man who possessed everything she wanted to gain, yet was completely willing to risk losing it all over a moral principle, over a housekeeper's child. Over the following 3 weeks, they did try to salvage the relationship. They had several more agonizing conversations. Cassandra did reflect on her behavior, to her credit, far more than Arthur had initially expected her to. But through that intense period of reflection, an undeniable, painful truth became blindingly clear to both of them. They were fundamentally not the same kind of people at their core. They did not share the same soul, not where it counted most. The engagement ended quietly 3 weeks later with mutual painful honesty. The diamond ring was returned, the wedding plans were permanently canceled, and they parted ways forever. And then something happened that absolutely nobody expected, not even Arthur. You see, what you plant in a person's life when you act with pure kindness, especially when you think no one is watching, has a beautiful way of growing into a forest of grace far beyond anything you could ever plan. Word of what had occurred at the penthouse party began to travel the way truth always does. It didn't happen loudly, and it certainly wasn't issued in a corporate press release. It flowed through the quiet, unseen currents of whispers, gossip, and human connection that move through communities. The high society guests who had been standing nearby knew exactly what Cassandra had said. The catering staff members talked to other workers. Friends of friends began putting the scattered pieces of the puzzle together. Eventually, a local journalist who covered the city's prominent business community, heard a version of the story and reached out directly to Arthur's office for an official comment. Arthur, true to his private nature, completely declined to speak about his personal life or his broken engagement. But the story leaked out to the public anyway, incomplete and highly speculative, the way internet stories often do. What absolutely nobody had anticipated, however, was the overwhelming tidal wave of human response. Within 48 hours of a partial version of the incident circulating on social media, shared by a guest who had witnessed Cassandra's cruelty, Arthur's corporate offices were completely flooded with hundreds of thousands of messages. The messages weren't about his multi-million-dollar real estate business. They were entirely about Elena and Lily. People from all walks of life wrote in, pouring their hearts out. They shared that they had found themselves in Elena's exact heartbreaking situation before. They wrote about the times they had been cruelly laughed at, mocked for their cheap clothes, judged for their low-income jobs, or looked down upon because of their children's appearances. They desperately wanted to know if Elena and her little girl were okay. Elena's humble story had powerfully reminded millions of people of their own mothers, their own grandmothers, and their own early years of exhausting financial struggle. Arthur sat alone in his massive office, reading through those emotional messages quietly, feeling a profound sense of peace settle deep in his chest. He knew exactly what he had to do. The following morning, he called Elena into his office. Elena walked in feeling visibly anxious because being summoned to a formal meeting in his corporate office was entirely outside of their usual easy-going household routine. She sat down carefully in the leather chair across from his large desk, looking worried and uncertain. Arthur had a thick professional folder sitting in front of him. Without saying a word, he slowly slid the folder across the desk to her. Elena looked at him hesitantly, then opened it. The moment her eyes scanned the documents inside, her entire face went completely still, and the breath caught in her throat. It was a full unconditional scholarship fund, meticulously researched and legally arranged by Arthur and his personal team of attorneys. It was a fully funded educational trust set up entirely in Lily's name, covering her education completely from preschool all the way through a university doctorate degree. Whatever prestigious school Lily ever wanted to attend, whatever career path she chose to pursue in her life, it was completely paid for in full. Elena slowly looked up from the legal documents, her eyes brimming with a mountain of tears. "Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion, "why? Why would you do something so massive for us?" Arthur leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, his eyes filled with profound sincerity. "Because Lily looked up at my expensive chandelier as if it were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen in her life," he said softly. "And a child possessing that kind of pure wonder deserves to have a truly great life." He paused for a moment, letting the words settle. "And more importantly, Elena, because you raised her beautifully." She held out her only bread roll and offered me a bite. She is only 3 years old, and her very first instinct upon meeting a stranger was to share the most valuable thing she had. That beautiful character does not happen by accident. That pure heart comes entirely from you." Elena pressed her trembling hand over her mouth, and the tears finally came cascading down her face, quietly and completely. But there was something else tucked into the bottom of that folder as well. It was an official corporate document showing that Elena's salary as his house manager had been significantly increased, effective immediately, accompanied by top-tier comprehensive health and dental benefits for both herself and Lily, vital protections they had never possessed before. Arthur didn't make a grand public speech about his generosity. He didn't post a single word about it on social media, and he certainly didn't call any of the journalists begging for an interview. It was simply done because it was the absolute right thing to do. And Arthur had always fiercely believed that doing the right thing never requires a public audience. But here is the beautiful part of this story that stays with my soul the most. Several months later, Arthur was attending a local community fundraiser event on the lower income side of the city. He had been quietly, anonymously involved in supporting and funding youth education programs there for many years. He was standing near the back of the crowded gymnasium, warmly watching a group of local children perform a small, energetic musical routine on a makeshift wooden stage. Suddenly, he felt a tiny, gentle hand tap against his own. He slowly looked down. Standing right there beside him was Lily. She was wearing a vibrant, bright red dress, looking up at him with those enormous, beautiful brown eyes. Elena was standing a few feet behind her, laughing softly at her young daughter's immense boldness. Lily reached deep into the small plastic bag she was carrying and carefully pulled out half of a granola bar, slightly squashed and crumpled from her grip, and held it up to Arthur with absolute, unwavering seriousness. The billionaire crouched down on the dusty gym floor, bringing himself right to her eye level. "Is this for me?" he asked softly. Lily nodded her head with immense seriousness. Arthur gently took the squashed granola bar from her tiny hand. He looked into her eyes and said, "Thank you, Lily." And he meant those words more deeply than he had ever meant a thank you in his entire life. Elena watched the interaction from a few steps back, her hand pressed tightly over her heart, her eyes bright with tears of pure gratitude. And as Arthur crouched there on the floor of that humble community center, dressed in his expensive clothes, holding half of a squashed granola bar given to him by a 3-year-old girl in a cheap red dress, he realized the ultimate truth. This right here was real wealth. Not the luxury penthouse, not the 12-state real estate portfolio, and certainly not the business magazine covers. True wealth was being the exact kind of human being that a pure, innocent child wanted to feed from her own small, limited supply. He realized that he had almost married a woman who would have slowly, calculatedly pulled him away from being this kind of person, and one beautiful little girl in a $4 thrift store dress, staring at a sparkling chandelier, had somehow saved his entire life from that empty future without ever even knowing she had done anything at all. Here is the powerful moral that I want to leave deep in your heart today. The exact way you choose to treat people who can absolutely give you nothing in return, the children, the working class, the quiet people serving in the backgrounds of your life, that is the one true, undeniable measure of your human character. It is not your net worth, it is not your expensive wardrobe, and it is not your powerful social connections. Your true character lives exclusively in those small, unguarded, hidden moments when nobody important is watching you. And sometimes the most powerful, influential presence in any room is not the person with the most money or the most stunning clothes. Sometimes It is a 3-year-old child holding a simple bread roll and a generous heart, reminding the entire world what it actually means to be truly rich.